Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. About a year and a half ago, we had a session about Round Rock history. We call it Round Rock in her own words. Obviously, there's enough words to go around to make a series that could last forever. We're happy to have with us a panel of authors who've written about Round Rock, as well as folks who have lived through Round Rock. Janie Carlin is supposed to be here, but her mom's been ill, so we've moved her to that end, so she may be coming in a little bit later. But we have with us Brad Stutzman, who's going to be emceeing the session. And we have Linda Scarborough, who is with the Williamson County Sun. Yeah, I believe you're editor and owner, correct?
Well, no. Oh, my glasses just fell apart.
That has now been memorialized.
Oh, well, co-publisher with my husband. I'm really
Maybe a younger man. Be a good panel.
I used to edit it a long time ago. Sorry.
We have Janice Krienke Rebenaldt, and it's an interesting story in that her daughter came to our house in Taylor because she loved our house and recolored it and walked through it, and then she walked in my office earlier this week and said, I know you from somewhere. And her daughter, I guess partially inspired by my house, became an architect. So that's pretty cool. Bob Brinkman has served on the Williamson County Board, the Williamson County Historical Commission. He's with the Texas Historical Commission, right?
Right.
And he's been around. You grew up here, didn't you?
Since I was so high.
Yes, he was so high. So he's been here since so high. We have Jes Hernandez, and you've been here for what, three generations?
Something like that.
Yeah. Not you personally, but you've aged well. And we have with us Karen Thompson, who's one of our primary authors that we have here, going back all the way with Jane D. Gesualdo, and then she's done some pictorial work since then. Welcome, Karen. We have Janie Carlin Castillo, and I know Janie from quilting. But she's also related to probably 3 or 4 people in this room, I think. So I'm always happy to have a Carlin join us. And then Dorothy Blanco, who's come highly recommended from Jes Hernandez. So she'll add some other families. And your family name is Blanco. Do you have it? What's your other family?
No, that's my married name. My family was Alvarado's.
Okay, good. And so we have quite a good selection of folks. So when Jessie does come here, she is a Mercer, and their family goes back to the late 1800s. So hopefully she'll be able to make it. And with that, we have Brad Stutzman is going to be facilitating. And the instructions for everybody was just to talk for about 10 minutes, fairly loosely, about what they see as important of old Round Rock history. We're not so interested in the current. Staff had asked, what is Hester's Crossing? What are the building named for downtown? Who was the first volunteer fire department chief? And we've got a representative here for that. So without further ado, Brad, I hand it to you.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. Thank you for coming. My name is Brad Stutzman. I'm the editor of the Round Rock Leader newspaper. And as your moderator and facilitator today, hopefully I'll just kind of move things along. And otherwise, just like a good interview, we'll try to kind of stay out of the way and not step on anybody here. Most of the folks on this panel I know and have known for a long time. Linda and I used to work together, and if I may, I'll give a plug for her book right now, Road, River, and Old Boy Politics. It's a National Council of Public History Best Book Award winner, and this is a treasure trove of how we got from there to here in recent decades in Round Rock and Williamson counties. When I was asked to be on this panel today, I thought of a couple of things. One of the things I thought of was the quotation from the Bible where it says, without vision, the people perish. And I think that's kind of a little bit what we're here to do today, because vision works a couple of ways. It's why we have windshield on our car, but also a rear view mirror to look behind you to see where you've come from, because often it helps to know where you've been to figure out where you are and where you're going to go. Bob, down there, we've known each other for a number of years. Anything you want to know about Round Rock High School or the Dragons? Since George Brazil from the Statesman has now passed on, Bob is going to be our resident expert. If you were to ask him who won the game between Round Rock and Georgetown in 1958, he could tell you like that.
Georgetown.
Right. Okay, say.
Round Rock was 0-10 that year.
Jes, met him a few months ago, and he's just from a wonderful, wonderful family, and I hope he tells us a little bit about the new middle school here in town. Karen and I have known each other a number of years. She's the author of Historical Round Rock, and there's actually in her book, she starts off her book with a quote that I think of so often when I'm writing things. It's from Thornton Wilder's Our Town. And this is the way we were in our growing up, in our marrying, in our living, in our dying. And I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit today too. And Janie, down there, we've known each other, and I've known the Carlins forever, going back to Brinkman Elementary and everything, where her brother was principal. And I think she can tell us some interesting things about the history of St. William Church, in addition to everything else. And Ms. Blanco, that we hadn't met before.
I'm the new kid on the block.
So, no, I'm probably the new kid on the block, and I'm the kid. So, that said, with no further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Linda here, and I think we'll just sort of go down the line, and everybody can, we'll do what we do.
Okay. Is this on? Mm-hmm. So you guys can hear me? Okay. Because otherwise I was going to stand up in front of you, because move. I will give also a plug to my mother's book, which is a great foundation history of Williamson County, called Land of Good Water, and I'm sure you all have many copies in the library here and probably have all read it. But if you haven't, it's what one of your cohorts at the Statesman described when he was heading up the Statesman Bureau here. He said, we use it as our Bible. And it's just that important. So I'll give that little plug. But while I was researching my book, Road, River, and Old Boy Politics, this one, which tells the story of how the groundwork, principally water and transportation resources, was laid for Williamson County's astonishing metamorphosis from an agricultural backwater into a super suburb. I ran across numerous characters whose actions radically altered our economic, environmental, and cultural landscapes. Several of these were from Round Rock. For Round Rock, the most radical change in its future outlook was made probably in the mid-1940s without anybody here ever knowing about it. The deal that was made by two Taylor businessmen, banker John Griffith and this cotton, he started with cotton pallets, but he became the manufacturer of many mattresses. Biggest mattress manufacturer in the United States was in Taylor for some time. David Fontaine Forwood, who basically convinced Texas Highway Department czar DeWitt C. Greer, who was planning the interstate highway system right after the war, to abandon his plan to run the interstate south from Temple through the east side of Williamson County, which made sense then because it was the heavily developed industrial end of the county, parallel to those railroad tracks that run from Bartlett through Granger and then down into Taylor. But at Taylor, turning west toward Round Rock, but instead of going into Round Rock, heading then slicing into Austin through Pflugerville. So, in that plan, I-35 would have completely missed both Georgetown and Round Rock, and you can just sit around and imagine ramifications for future development. Three other men, Tom and Moses Corey of Austin and Tom Nelson Jr. of Austin, but from a family with deep and profound roots in Round Rock, also made huge impacts on Round Rock's development. again, outside Round Rock's movers and shakers. Nelson, ironically, while working for the Austin Chamber of Commerce, go figure, brought Westinghouse Corporation to Round Rock, a big manufacturing facility, which still is there under a different name. And the Quarry brothers essentially created Highway 1431 out of thin air. I mean, that was essentially a developer's boondoggle road, and they made it happen. For the details of these men's clever and far-reaching efforts, you'll have to read the book. But today, I thought, sorry. Okay, no more of that. Today, I'm going to talk, though, about the interstate's path through Round Rock, a path that was contentious to the max, and that probably wouldn't have happened had it been proposed today. I'm sure, even though many of you are newcomers, that most of you are probably familiar with the story of Louis Henna and his huge impact on Round Rock. When the interstate was being planned, Henna was then the much-loved mayor of a town of 1,000 people, just maybe a few more than 1,000. A genuine hero in many respects, who gave the site for the Texas Baptist Children's Home and substantial monies besides for the construction out of his own pocket to get that wonderful project off the ground. He did many other great things, which you can read about in other places. He also, however, owned 2 other very large properties at the intersection of Highway 81 and Highway 79. So he had, in effect, controlled 3 of the 4 corners of that intersection. And he, big surprise, favored the route that the Highway Department eventually adopted, which ran, of course, right by his properties and kept close to downtown without actually ramming the interstate down Mays, which actually is what most of the local businessmen wanted at the time. They were so terrified that they were going to lose that little gas business, you know, that all those people from Dallas driving through and those little cafes, they were so terrified. This happened in Georgetown too, that there were serious proposals to actually put an interstate right through downtown. Georgetown had the same idea and made a pitch to run the interstate on one side of the courthouse going north and the other side of the courthouse going south. So that's just an interesting little picture. But there was another group with a completely different idea. They were headed by retired Colonel W. Ross Irvin and his wife Helen, who purchased a 100-year-old Washington Anderson home on Brushy Creek. It was a famous landmark, but in terrible condition, and renovated in the early 50s, right after they sort of retired from the military service. Soon, many of their friends followed them to Round Rock. They sort of fell in love with this little place. Among the most notable projects included Colonel William and Ann Todd's, their son says, fabulous renovation of the circa 1934, then called Mexican schoolhouse, Colonel Alex and Ruth McNabb's restoration of an elegant 1853 home on Brushy Creek, which today I believe is still owned by Don Quick, the realtor, unless he just sold it yesterday. And Gerald T.F. and Mildred Wessels. General T.F. and Mildred Wessels' restoration of a house that's now sort of in the middle of that First United Methodist Church complex. Old-timers called this group the Army Colony, rather contemptuously. These people were sophisticated world travelers. They lived all over. They loved entertaining on their patios. They had this sort of round-robin cocktail party that went on to salute the setting sun every evening. They were light years different from the conservative farmers and ranchers who had settled and built this town and were, to a certain extent, still running it. These people formed a group called the Round Rock Historical Society. How am I doing on time?
Oh, I think you're fine.
Okay. And tapped many prominent local citizens. They had a vision. Speaking of Brad's vision, Williamsburg on the Brushy. And Round Rock had, and this is really a pretty unusual, you found it in Salado, you found it in Fredericksburg, and you found it in a few other towns, but you found few towns in Texas with these intact neighborhoods with lots of 1850 and 1860 homes and businesses in what was the old town over by Brushy Creek. Restoration was already underway. The place had all kinds of interesting historic stories to tell. The gunfighters that you all know about, Sam Bass and John Wesley Hardin, the story about the Great Seal of Texas being, secreted out of the Capitol when Sam Houston was trying to move the Capitol to Houston from Austin. They put it here in Round Rock. And of course the Chisholm Trail and all of the tales that involved. But after a private meeting between Mayor Henna, one city council person, and one engineer from the State Highway Department, it was announced that I-35 would run right through that part of that old town. It was going to miss the homes that had been restored, but just by half a block or a block. And really, it was sort of like a hammer falling on a piece of delicate hand-blown glass. Obviously, there was going to be no Texas-style Williamsburg if an interstate sliced through the middle of it. So there was a protracted fight between Henna's forces and the Historical Society, which whipped up a considerable amount of support through petitions, letters to the editors, and finally historic societies in San Antonio and Austin joined the Round Rock people and rallied to their cry for a public hearing where everybody was invited to discuss three different options for that route through Round Rock. The Highways Department, Henna's favorite route, which is what ultimately got chosen, of course, and then another route that would have looped east, and a third loop that would have looped west. And that was the one that the historic heritage people wanted. Helen Irvin, the wife of Colonel Irvin, that first couple who had moved here and restored that big old home down on the river, became chief spokesperson for the Historical Society forces. She charmed this legendary county judge, Sam Stone, into opportuning for her or on her behalf to DeWitt Greer to get this hearing, and forced it was actually a closed hearing, but there were a lot of supplicants from Round Rock there. And the case was presented, and essentially it was on two grounds. The first was that the route that the Texas Highway Department had chosen, its preferred route, flew in the face of its own, what is it called? its own
Policy.
thank you, which was to bypass cities of less than 150,000 people. Secondly, it would be, at least in theory, less expensive. We all know what happened, who prevailed, but when I unearthed this story, which nobody had told me, I had been going around Round Rock talking to people like Bunky Whitlow, and saying, was there any controversy over that route? And they would say, nah, no controversy. And when I finally found this hoard, this piles and piles of letters and petitions and newspaper stories and everything, and transcripts from these hearings, and figured out that there had indeed been quite a fight over what to do with this city. I just thought it was really important to tell that story in the book, and let people know that Helen Irvin and her Round Rock Historical Society had tried to protect and develop this thing that Round Rock once had in abundance, but whose value was certainly eroded by that placement of I-35, the historic core and the sense of place. That's it. Thank
Very
you.
interesting. And think of how different it would be today if I-35 had gone through Taylor. It would be very different for us and very different for Taylor as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So, okay, moving along, Janice, you're up next. It's your turn.
Okay. I was Janice Krienke before I married my husband, John Rebenaldt. My mother flew in. I know how she drives, so that's an accurate term, from South Austin. And she's sitting in the back, and she's much more of a historian of Round Rock than I am, because she and my dad both graduated from Round Rock High School in the late 40s, early 50s. Okay. If you ever have thought about if you could have one wish of anything, what you would wish for? Have y'all ever thought of that? I've thought of that, and my wish that's completely, I thought, impossible would be to time travel. I think it would be so cool to go back, when things were different. Well, after having lived in West Texas for 39 years and coming back off and on, several times a year for that 39 years, coming back to Round Rock is like time traveling. It really is. When my parents bought a home that was then US 81, which is now I-35, I don't know if my parents knew that beforehand, but it was in Pflugerville School District, and my parents had gone to Round Rock High School, so, they were able to get permission from Mr. Grisham for us to go to Round Rock schools, but in order to do that, we had to catch the bus at a place other than our home. And so my mom would drive us to this little Caliche County road, and we would wait there for the bus to come back up the Caliche Road. And, I'm not ancient, I don't quite use a cane yet, but that was the intersection of 45 and 35 when I was in high school. And so that shows you how things have changed. It's changed a lot. My grandparents, the Krienke grandparents, first came to Round Rock in October of 1929, so 81 years ago, when my dad was just 6 weeks old. And my grandfather came because they had just established the old folks and orphans home. It's what's now Trinity Lutheran Home on the east, well, I shouldn't say the east part of Round Rock. It used to be the east part of Round Rock. And I remember that my grandmother had a quilt that the children had made and embroidered their names on it. And she not only had 6 children of her own, but then she had all these orphans who she treated as her own. So it was a neat thing. She had a lot of fond memories. I could tell when she would, look at the quilt and finger and say, this was, this child and this was this child. And so my dad was number 2 in the 6 children, and all 6 of the children went from first grade to graduation in Round Rock schools. And you may know what I'm going to say next, because having 6 children in the school system and being the administrator of the orphans and old folks home in Round Rock, my grandfather was elected to the school board shortly after coming to Round Rock. And he served on the school board for about 5 years, and then he was elected the president of the school board, and he was that for 20 years until his untimely death when he was only 60 years old. My grandmother used to tell us, I was only 3 when he passed away, so I don't have a lot of memories of him, but my grandmother lived a lot longer, so I do remember what she told me, and she said she remembered that every month one of the big tasks for the school board president was to sign all of the payroll checks for the Round Rock ISD employees, if you can imagine. But back when I was in high school, I can remember the sign that's out where now the 7-Eleven is on 79. That was the city limit sign of Round Rock. And the population was 2,500. So
How many people do you figure worked in the school system back then? Something
we
like
had
4,000
3
today.
teachers in each grade level.
Okay.
So, and we had about 500 kids in high school the year I graduated,
And what
which
year
was the
that?
last year, 71, the last year
71.
that Round Rock High School was in what is now C.D. Folks Middle School. C.D. Folks was my principal my sophomore through junior years, and then Robert Griffith was my principal in junior high, and then my senior year in high school. And Claude Brinkman was my principal in elementary school, and Zena Voigt was my principal in elementary school.
So if anybody taught you, they got a building named after them.
Cool.
That happened in Georgetown too.
One thing I've noticed over the years is, having lived here myself only since about 1981 now, still a relative newcomer, is that you can tell how long someone's lived in a community by what they call the various landmarks around town. The school buildings can, like Williams Middle School out University Avenue in Georgetown near Southwestern. It was the high school, then the junior high, and it's had several names over the years, and you can tell how long somebody's lived there. The longer they've lived there, the farther back their memory goes of what it used to be called.
And you can imagine, because I've been gone for 39 years, so everything, when my mother tries to give me directions to go someplace, she's like, oh, okay, what used to be it? So we moved to a house on 35, which is still there. It's 150 years old?
About, yes.
Okay. You've probably seen it and not realized, I think it's a used car lot now. It's a big white 2-story house at the Howard Lane, kind of close to the Howard Lane exit, right across from the smaller of the 2 cemeteries. Okay, that was my home growing up for, what, Mother, 45 years?
42 years.
42 years, okay. They lived there. And when we moved there, well, we hadn't quite sold our house in Austin, so I actually came home from the hospital to Round Rock, but then I took a little detour with my family to Dallas and then to Austin. But I came back in time for 2nd grade. And I lived with each grandparent for a semester, which was really, really cool because I got to know my grandparents so well. But being in Pflugerville School District, and at the time, now y'all are going to really laugh on this one, 3rd and 4th grade were in the same classroom in Pflugerville. And so my mother didn't want us to go to Pflugerville schools. And my sister tells me that she thinks that Mother didn't want us to go there because there were too many cousins and we might end up, getting fond of some of our cousins. Because on her side of the family, my great-grandfather was John Pfluger, whose father was Henry Pfluger, who was the patriarch of Pflugerville. So I have a lot of deep roots. I think a while ago I was saying that 6 of my great-grandparents are buried within just a few miles of the house on I-35, like 10 miles. So all kinds of sides. Don't talk about anybody in Old Round Rock because I'm probably kin to them. Okay, let's see. My dad remembers when he was in first grade taking a check to Mrs. Voigt every month because his birthday is September 4th, and he wasn't quite old enough, so in order to go to school that year, he had to pay tuition, and even though his dad was the president of the school board, there were no special favors, so that's what he remembers about being in first grade. My sisters and my brother also had Mrs. Voigt, Miss Voigt. I was not lucky enough. We were in the hinterlands in Dallas at that year. And Nina Berkman, who was Claude Berkman's sister, was also my teacher and my dad's teacher and my mom's teacher, and economics in high school. So there's a lot of continuity there back then. My grandparents, Krienke grandparents, in the mid to late 1940s bought land in West Round Rock. I believe it was a section. Was it that much? A little over a section. And due to some unfortunate things, my grandmother ended up selling it in the 1960s. Well, otherwise we'd be millionaires because that's what's now known as Great Oaks and Tonquah Springs. That was on their property, all of that. So, darn it anyway. Okay. My grandfather commuted from the ranch. There was no 3406. Okay, is that what it is? 3406? Okay, there was no 3406. You had to go all the way down Sam Bass Road. My grandparents lived across, their land was across the road from the Walshes and the Burns ranches. And you had to go all the way down there on the back road, down Sam Bass Road, to get to Round Rock. And then my grandfather commuted to West Taylor to be the minister at that church also. He was the minister at St. Paul's in Taylor before they moved to Round Rock, and then he went back to do that. And just like his father had been, his father went to school in Switzerland, and he dated a lady in Germany his last year in seminary, which was a big no-no. And so his punishment was that he got banished to Texas as a missionary. So
Did he bring her along? Did he bring her along?
his wife?
Yeah. No, the woman he dated.
Oh, the woman he dated is my great-grandmother, but she had to come a year later, and it was like almost like a mail-order bride thing. You know, he sent for her, and they went down to the coast, and then they made their way up to Fredericksburg, and they were visiting with the pastor and his wife there, and the pastor said, well, it's late, we have to, it's time to turn in, and his wife said, but you haven't married the young people, and we only have one bed for them to sleep in. So my great-grandmother put on her wedding dress, and they got married. That was in 1893 in Fredericksburg. So, and my husband's mother's family's from Fredericksburg, so I always tried to find, a connection there, like kissing cousins or something, but never was able to do that. Let's see. Oh, and Grandpa and Grandma had to drive their 6 children all those 12 years times. They were spread out. One is 8 years older than me, and then the oldest one, golly, is probably more than 30 years my senior. So it was like for 40 years they were having children. And they each went to school 12 years, or 11, whatever it was back then. And so they had to drive the kids all the way in from out at the ranch, and that was not a perk of being school board president. You didn't have a bus, and they had to drive them in. There was nothing associated with that. Let's see. My mom is a Round Rock native also, and I'll just mention her family were the Groscups, and she had lived in Hutto, Taylor, where else? Manor, Richland, all around, but finally saw the light. Her parents came to Round Rock when she was, what, in 8th grade? 8th grade. And they lived at the old St. Charles Hotel, if y'all know where that is, out on, I think, is it on Chisholm Trail? Is that the name of the street? I just know locations. I don't know street names. And so they lived there for a while. And then they moved to the house that I knew for a lot of years as their home. Actually, they were just renting it, which was a real rude awakening when the people decided to sell it. But it's the house at 602 East Liberty, the big 2-story house. And my father was, as the children of the administrator of Trinity Lutheran, lived in a big 2-story house. And my daughter, who is all into historical stuff, said, "Oh my gosh, Mom, Mimi and Papa lived in the 2 most beautiful houses in the whole city of Round Rock." You know? But they didn't own them, so. Let's see. I remember my grandmother, Grosscup, worked at Trinity Lutheran Home. One grandfather was administrator, the other grandmother worked there, and with the old folks, and she used to always take us down there. We were 3 little girls and then a boy, and she would have us sing to the old people, and I never quite understood why it was such a big deal, but they absolutely loved it. So we would sing all the songs that we knew from Sunday school, and then we would also sing little German songs that my grandmother had taught us. Oh, the people they just adored us. It was so neat, but we were kind of intimidated by all this, you know. And I don't have my computer here yet. I just came for good on Tuesday night, back to Round Rock, and I came the very next day to talk to your director, Dale, because my daughter had Photoshop, before there was Photoshop, had Photoshopped her Taylor house because she fell in love with it. So I was faced with the task of writing this, what to me was a very intimidating letter to Mrs. Rickliffs about, "My daughter loves your house, can we come see it?" And she graciously said, "Of course, come on." And so I came to see her the very next day when I got back and said, "Have any jobs?" I'd like to do something part-time.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
In time for my first grandchild.
Yeah. You know, you'd mentioned Claude Berkman there. I remember as late as the mid-1990s, and Mr. Berkman must have been 90 years old then if he was a day, he would go over sometimes still to visit Berkman Elementary, and the kids would get the biggest kick out of it because here is the person the school is named after. It's a real, live, living person, and here he is, and it was always a neat experience. Mr. Brinkman, how are you today, sir?
Oh, just fine, and you?
Very good. Take it away, Bob.
So we moved from a very scholarly historian who discovered this untold story of 1950s Round Rock and an old-timey resident of Round Rock to someone who can't recollect what I had for breakfast. But I will do my best. I guess my family came to Round Rock when they were absolutely sure there was no threat of hostile Indians or yellow fever, because we came in 1979, a little later than the rest. The high school had 500 people in the whole school when you were there. There were 535 in my class in 1988. So I got here when Round Rock was starting to really grow. I've gotten most of my knowledge of Round Rock from books that others have written and reading almost every issue of the Round Rock Leader since they've kept it since 1929. And there's some older issues there too. I think the thing that strikes me about Round Rock is that it's always been close enough to the state capitol to benefit from transportation and trade and everything, but far enough away to retain its own identity. Every road that's here today was originally a horse path or an Indian trail, and then there was the stagecoach routes in the 1840s coming up from San Antonio and Austin to points north and east, and the stagecoach, one of the stagecoach stops is still standing as the core of Gumbo's restaurant, and the other one is on the north side of Rushy Creek, the 2-story stone house at number 4 or 6, wherever that is, Chisholm Trail. And then likewise with the cattle trails, Round Rock was always on the trail, on the line of the Chisholm Trail, and again with railroads, with the speaking of an interstate, whether or not it comes to a town, lots of towns in the 1800s were created or disappeared depending on how close the railroad was. If it was a mile away, such as from the the town of Gabriel Mills in western Williamson County to Bertram, where they put the railroad, they just picked up the buildings if they could, or disassembled them and moved them to the new place. And there's nothing left of the old place except maybe a cemetery, or maybe a road name. But in the case of Round Rock, the railroad came a little less than a mile from the older town that was on Brushy Creek with these 1850s, 1860s limestone buildings, but far enough away to be a distinct town. And so the new town became known as Newtown and took the post office name from Round Rock, and the old town was called Old Round Rock. And it actually wasn't part of the city limits, I think, until the late 60s or early 70s. It was still a separate place less than a mile away. But that was actually to its benefit that some of these buildings were a little forgotten, and there wasn't a chance to change them all up or build new houses or things, so it was very intact. And there was a chance to do this Round Rock Williamsburg. But I really love the chapter about that, because I work at the Texas Historical Commission, which is referenced in there, which had just begun in 1953, and I think it says there's a letter to them asking for help, and there's no letter back. And we don't even have the letter to the THC in our file, so that was just kind of interesting. I wish I could do time travel, because I keep trying to find obscure 1913 football scores, and they're not out. Because Round Rock was a separate place and had its own newspaper since 1876, but didn't start keeping it for 53 years. That's one thing I do in time travel, is get them on the stick in 1876. There's lots of news of Round Rock that's not available because it was in the Round Rock paper and wouldn't make the Austin paper or the Georgetown or Taylor paper. But if you are looking for stories like that, the Georgetown and Taylor papers both go back to 1876. They would occasionally have a little column reprinted from other nearby towns. So it'll have Round Rock and Bartlett and Granger and places like that, and also places that were rural locations that were schools then and are now school names now in the Round Rock School District, which is a great benefit. Thanks much in part to Ms. Karen Thompson, Stony Point, and Cedar Valley, and Gaddy's, and all of these schools that were rural schools that got incorporated into the Round Rock School District live on as school names, and that's an important thing for our heritage, I'd say. I think that's all I have for now.
I appreciate that, Bob. Jess?
One thing I was
Yes,
going to
sir.
mention too, when you're talking about General Wesley, okay? The thing about him, when he got here, he built a golf course. I don't know if it was a 18-hole, but he had like, he had a golf course around his house. And that's what stood out, and everybody would drive by there and see this. Well, a lot of us never seen golf or a golf course, and these little flags, and this
You mean it was all
nice
the way
lawn,
around?
you
It was
know.
all the way around the house?
I kind of remember maybe like 3 holes right in the front of what you call the entranceway, right there. And you'd see him out there, And at that time, I used to work for the Ford Motor Company that was right where this building is at, okay? And he would bring his lawnmowers, and he wanted them, and of course, back then, we didn't know how to set them, how high and all that kind of stuff. But he talked to you like, you were a military troop, and I guess he expected us to stand at attention while he was talking, stuff like that. And the other thing too about Georgetown beating Round Rock, not only in 58, but 57, 58, and 59. I was there.
Me too.
You were there too.
Yeah.
Okay,
On
I
the
was
other
born in
side.
1941 here in Round Rock. Both of my parents were born right here in Round Rock in 1920, 1924. I went all 12 grades through Round Rock School District. And I had I played Little League Baseball. I joined the Boy Scouts here in Round Rock. I couldn't wait to get out of Dodge. So in 1961, I joined the Air Force. I spent 22 years in the Air Force. I came back to Round Rock, and then I worked another 20 years for the post office. So now I'm retired.
Excellent.
That's all I have.
Did you work with my dad, my uncle?
Pardon?
Did you work with Carl and Milton Creek?
Sure, I work right with him.
Long before I ever met Jess, I know his brother Tino, because he was He was the car insurance agent for my mom and dad,
Yeah.
back when they were living, so in the small world department there. And then you have another brother, the school was named after just
Yeah,
recently.
Robert,
Could
yeah.
you tell us a little bit about the school naming and everything? It was hopefully some of you got to go, or maybe you read about it in the paper, saw it on TV. It was a wonderful ceremony about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
What they had called the Stony Point Ninth Grade Center.
Right. It was a very emotional experience for the whole family. I mean, you know, to have something, you know, well, my brother's name won't be forgotten. I can't say anymore, I get very
Okay.
emotional.
His brother
Thank you.
Robert was the only Round Rock serviceman killed in Vietnam. He was in the Marine Corps. And this was back in 1968, I believe. It was 1968.
1968.
Yeah.
Better be, that's what I have in the books.
Okay.
Did you attend the?
You know, that must have been a tremendous impact on a town so small. You'd think, well, you know, one hometown boy lost. Terrible, but not that big a deal. You gotta remember how small Round Rock was then. You know, less than 1,000, less than a thousand people. You know what I was thinking as we've been talking here, another reason this is so important is so that things like that, everything that we've been talking about isn't lost. History doesn't keep track of itself. Somebody needs to do it. And it amazes me. You can lose it like that. Vivian Wood, the county clerk, or excuse me, county treasurer, tells a story, and every time I think about it, my jaw drops open. Down in Georgetown, near Harry Gold's department store, there's a bust of Harry there, God rest him. And I think Harry passed away about 96. And Vivian says she's walking down the street one day, and a couple is standing there. And this store had been in the family 3 generations. She's standing there, and a couple is kind of reading about it, and one of them turns to the other and says, "Who the heck is Harry Gold?" And Vivian says to me, "Brad, I never thought I would see the day where I'd be standing in downtown Georgetown and somebody would say, 'Who the heck is Harry Gold?'" So you can lose it just like that. Thanks to people like Karen Thompson, though, and other folks on this panel, we don't lose it. So Karen, take it
Well,
away.
let me tell you a little bit about me and how I got interested in doing books. I've written 6, 7, 8 books. 2 major books on Round Rock. Well, a third of the Williamson County book has Round Rock. I'm a 7th generation Texan. My family came with Stephen F. Austin's 3rd colony, the little colony in Bastrop, and have one of my German ancestors was the founder of New Braunfels. So I'm an only child, born in 1944. That makes me 66. And my parents, being an only child, my parents were a little bit older. My dad was born in 1900. My mother was born in 1910. So they were of this generation that had a lot more history into their background. And so being an only child, I loved all those old stories. And I'm a 5th generation Austinite, so in the 5th grade at Cassis, we were to start doing a research. And I'm going, all right. And it's about our family, our brothers. And she said, well, this will be easy. Tell about your brothers and sisters. And I went, well, heck, I don't have any brothers and sisters. So she said, well, how about grandparents? Well, by then they had all died. So I said, all right, I'm going to go a little further back. We've got further stuff than this. So I really started doing some pretty serious research in the 5th grade. And I looked back at some of my stuff and ended up writing a little autobiography called A Texas Girl. And I'll tell you, I looked at it about 20 years later, and it wasn't half bad. I was very interested in photographs. Now, my grandfather, Charles P. Luck, was one of Austin's early photographers from the 1890s through the 1930s to 1940. He died in 42. So had hundreds of his pictures. Well, I had gathered these. So in this little booklet that I wrote on notebook paper by hand and everything, and did borrow a typewriter and actually typed some of it, and I put a lot of pictures. Me at the coast, me at Galveston, me at all these places. And I'm going, this isn't half bad, and I need to know more about this. So I started collecting pictures. Well, today I have over 10,000 historic photographs in my collection. This started with my grandfather, and I've continued it on. And I got very interested in that time about the Republic of Texas. And I knew I had aunts, people that were cousins that were members of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. So when I got a little bit older, my mother had me in the children, but when I got 16, got very interested in what this Republic stuff was. So I really started gathering stuff, and I was very interested. I got a copy of a drawing of Kenny Fort. Now, Kenny Fort was established here in Round Rock. It's out where Gaddy School Road is, in 1839. Now, this is, of course, independence was gained at St. Jacinta, April 21st of 1836. So the Republic was only 3 years old, and there was a lot of movement. These families were that had got by, I had other family members. We had about 10, 15 different land grants, including some very large first-class land grants of over 10,000 acres. And so this Dr. Kenny was in Bastrop where when my original families started. And so I see this stuff about this Kenny Fort. Well, Kenny Fort, 1839, Williamson County wasn't founded till 1848 when the county and Georgetown were founded, but that was 9 years. So I was very interested and gathered up this stuff about Kenny Fort and actually used it in a paper at the university. And and at that time read quite a bit about Palm Valley and about Mrs. Palm bringing her family here and settling all of this Swedish settlement, which is the east part, Palm Valley. It was called Brushy and so forth. And had a lot of stuff about that and the Chisholm Trail, because I did have family that was involved with the Chisholm Trail. So I knew that much about Round Rock. Well, even though I was from Austin, I met this fella from Round Rock, Jollyville, another grandparent's a founder of Leander, Colonel C.C. Mason. So much to a couple of one aunt in particular said, "And you're dating this boy from where?" And so forth. Well, the end of the gist of the beginning of the story, 1966, David Thompson and I married, and we moved to Jollyville because his grandmother had just been left a widow, and the Thompson place is a big 2-story White House where Red Barn Nursery is now. That was the Thompson home. At one time there was a stage stop right there in the pasture. And so Granny had just become a widow that summer and wanted us to move there because she was by herself. And my husband said, "Well, let's move there temporarily." And I didn't know the Masons and the Thompsons that temporarily could be decades. These people just don't get off square one. And as it worked out, we were there at the farm for 9 years. And it was wonderful because Granny had been born in, now see, I was a little bit older, but now, see, I was from Austin. But I was horse crazy, and when I was a teenager, I got a horse. And I thought because I had a horse, I knew about rural life. Now, I don't know how in my brain that happened because by then all the actual farms and ranches in the family had been sold, and the person that founded New Braunfels, long since that had been sold, and they'd moved to Fayette County, and that was gone. So, but somehow because I had a horse and I read about rural, I thought I knew urban and rural history. And then I moved to this farm, and back in 66, Jollyville was still just a spot in the road over there, and the school district hadn't consolidated with Round Rock. It was still Pine Springs Common County Line School District with one little bitty school. So, but then I found out, because Granny had been born in 1893, that I didn't know beans about rural life. And the Thompson place was 125 acres, and she still had cows. Well, she had this wonderful cow named High Pockets that she fed food to all the time, scraps and stuff. And High Pockets, I would always have scraps and stuff, and she learned that right away, and she was constantly out there at my little gate behind our house there. And here was this cow all the time, and so I had to learn about cows. Thought I knew about cows because I had a horse. So I learned right away that, as Granny said, well, horses weren't near as important as mules. And I did learn from then and have since learned how important mules were. And I remember interviewing, and I can't even think of who it was right now, that down there by where La Fontera is, was the first, Selstrom, was the first farmer in Round Rock to sell his mules and buy a tractor, a gasoline tractor. And he was ridiculed by every farmer in Round Rock and the surrounding area because he sold his mules was he so stupid? And this machine was going to require gasoline, and where in the world was he going to get this gasoline? And to sell his mules. And his son had told me, he said his father was just ridiculed. And they would even talk to the wife. And she went to church one day, and why did you let your husband sell those mules, you know? As if she could stop him from selling those mules. So anyway, I thought I knew about stuff because I had a horse, and I learned that, well, mules were a lot better. So anyway, it got me very interested in Round Rock history, and the mail route had always been from Round Rock to Jollyville. And way back when, in the teens and 20s, when Granny was raising her kids, if she needed something from the pharmacy over here, she would give the money to Mr. Carter or whoever was the mailman at the time, give him the money, and then he would go by the drugstore and buy whatever it was and then bring it the next day with the mail. So it was and so after I'd been there just a couple of years, it became apparent that the Jollyville area, with development coming in and this talk of this Texas Instruments was now being built and so forth, and it was going to be a big deal. And this little bitty school district could not handle it. And besides that, the kids after the 5th or 6th grade had always come to Round Rock to finish high school. So they had all the Thompson kids came to high school over here and everything. So we did a thing and had an election, and the Pond Springs Common County Line School District in 1969 consolidated with Round Rock Independent School District and immediately built a school. And a lot of the Round Rock people were going, and you're going to build a school where? This was Spicewood Elementary. And of course, just after that, they were just building right away because that part was growing faster than Round Rock was. So all of this money from the school district was being funneled to the west side, who needed all these schools right away. So it was a very interesting period during that time. So I had been researching ever since I got married to do a Round Rock history book. And then in about 85, I was about ready. I had at least 1,200, 1,500 good pictures, and it had 20 years worth of research. And so I was going to San Antonio one day, and my friend Jane Swallow said, well, are you ever going to finish this book? And I said, well, I just can't get to the end of it. She said, well, let me help you. And I said, okay. So Jane helped me, and we took the stuff out to Ed Aiken at Aiken Press, and we just had boxes. I had boxes of stuff. And this was before computers, so everything had to be by hand. And got out there and said, do we have enough? And he went, are you kidding me? You stop this very moment. He said, you have enough for 3 books already. And of course, this came out then, 86 was a sesquicentennial winner. And how many pages is it? I used to know every page. Anyway, it's 583 pages. And we told him, the one thing he changed our mind about is that we said, and this is the history of Round Rock, and Sam Bass will not be in it. Because the history of Round Rock, Sam Bass was teeny. Most of y'all that were here, you never talked about Sam Bass. And that was just when the computers first came along and you put in Round Rock, Texas. I used to do it when I first got about computers and stuff. I'd put in Round Rock, Texas. And the only thing you would get was that Sam Bass robbed the bank there and was killed robbing the bank. Well, he's buried in Round Rock Cemetery. He never robbed the bank here. Never robbed the bank. If he got near the bank, we don't know it. He was coming out of Koppel's store. But see, that didn't seem fancy enough. He might have been going to rob the bank. One of his partners says they came here to scope out the bank, but they didn't get near the bank to anybody's knowledge. So even that was wrong because he didn't rob the bank. But then for years, when they used to do, for Round Rock Frontier Days, they used to do a reenactment, and for a lot of years, they had him, the reenactment, he was robbing the bank. And I would rail, and Jane would rail, and we would talk about, well, what about A.W. Grimes? They were the same age, and A.W. Grimes was the good guy wearing the white hat, and Sam Bass was the bad guy, illiterate, wearing the black hat, and he didn't have any kind of education, an orphan, was just a loser. And A.W. Grimes was from a wonderful family in Bastrop. He was married, he had children, just exact opposites. And today, they're buried in Round Rock Cemetery. Sam Bass is way over on the west side, A.W. Grimes is way over on the east side. And he's got commemorative stuff now. But way back in the 60s, they had him robbing the bank and so forth. But anyway, we told Ed Aiken.
Print the legend, as it says in.
Yes. We're leaving Sam Bass out because the history of Round Rock is so interesting. And he said, no, you can't. So he's about 3 or 4 pages. And the university, I have to say this all the time, the University of Oklahoma swore to me. I have 6 letters where they swear up on a stack of whatever they swear up in Oklahoma. I'm sorry. I was still not over last Saturday's game. I have to get in a dig every once in a while. Swore up and down that this picture that they had was Sam Bass as a teenager. Well, then after, and we went ahead and put it in here. Didn't want to, but we did, and have since found out it's not. But in my Round Rock, Texas, from Cowboys to Computers, that came out in 2000, I think. By then, Rick Miller had secured the picture that we had heard about that was from a man in San Antonio that had collected pictures, and we have the real Sam Bass picture in this book, thank goodness. But the one in the red book is not the Sam Bass picture.
Rick Miller is the county attorney up in Bell County.
Yes.
He wrote a book several years ago
book
about
on Sam Bass. It's the definitive Sam Bass book. It's wonderful. I had him come down here and we did a Sam Bass symposium along about the time he did his book, and about 6 people came. We sent all this stuff. This is going to be the real story of Sam Bass. This is going to be the definitive information, and we sent invitations to school teachers and all these people. People don't want to know the real story of Sam Bass. They want the story, the outlaw, the romanticized story. They don't really want to know the real story. Anyway, but I'm doing a 3rd book. Round Rock was in this book from 2000, Historical Williams County, Texas. And it starts out with Round Rock because it's a chronological thing, and of course, Round Rock was founded before the county. Something you had said, first of all, if you'd ever talked to McNabb's daughter, Ginger, who's a good friend of mine, that's where I got all the stuff on all of that kind of era, is Ginger McNabb, who married my friend Don Hart. But in Round Rock, in the last 20 years, I say 20 years, something like that, I have some friends that were from the Mexican, came here when Walsh went to Mexico in the late 1800s and he was a Catholic, and he had the white lime, and William Walsh knew a Catholic priest that he had actually met that was father at a church more in the interior, I forget the exact name, in Mexico. And he needed workers for the lime plant. And he went down there, but being a Catholic and a big family man, he did something that was kind of unheard of. He could have gone down into Mexico and he could have brought back 15 or 20 men without their families to come up here and work, and they could send back money or go back every once in a while. He could have done that. And that's what most people did, but he didn't. He was a real serious family man, Irish Catholic. And he wanted them to be willing to bring their families and come up here, and he would provide housing and work, and they would come up here. And these families are sort of like in Texas, the Republic, we have the very first of Stephen F. Austin's was the old 300, and it's a big deal to be in the old 300. Well, these are sort of like the Mexican Round Rock's old 300. These families that came up here, the Carlins and the Rubios and so forth, they came to work, but they brought their families. But in being 66, I do have some friends like Anita Pena, that's now Perez, that was, of course, raised here. Do you know Anita? Oh, yeah. Okay. We've been friends for about 30 or 40 years. And so in many of the era of segregation, there was the Mexican school. There was the Mexican families that lived in the flats. But a couple of things made Round Rock a little bit different, and I'm sure we all are you remember stories of that where you were treated less than whatever. When the Round Rock Theater, The Rock, opened, according to the Round Rock leader, it opened May 11th, 1939 was the grand opening. And of course it was covered tremendously as a theater in Round Rock. It was one of the smaller towns to have its own theater. The building is still right down there. It's next to Main Street Grill, the next to that. It did seat 280 downstairs and had a balcony. But let me tell you something about Mr. Rucker, what he did. He wanted of course, the Mexican families were all saying, but my mother, my grandmother, they don't speak English. So Mr. Rucker ordered, did you ever go there and see the Mexican films? Okay, he ordered Spanish language films, and they showed them usually Saturday night after the main picture. Then they had the Mexican movie. And this was pretty unusual for a town in Texas then. And so I know Anita always talked about, her mother would put all of the Pena kids in the afternoon, they would have to have a nap, because then when they got up, they had to get dressed. I mean, you didn't go wearing your everyday clothes. This was the theater on Saturday night, and you were going to see a Mexican film. Now, Anita remembers them. It was the same plot over and over again, and it was actually probably the same horses and the same, they would just change their scarf or their hat or whatever. But she said they loved them no matter what, and they were in Spanish. But Mr. Rucker did that. No organization, LULAC, NAACP, nobody came to town and said, now, Mr. Rucker, what about the Mexicans? Don't they need a movie? No, he did that. And I know for a fact, because I've interviewed a lot of people that said he never charged them. Now, I think he did have a charge of 10 cents or whatever. Something like that. But it was very nominal, and if you didn't have it, he did not charge, and particularly if it was a whole family. If you got 50 cents, everybody could go in, or whatever,
Karen,
So,
you're talking about the white line there, and I think that's going to segue wonderfully into our next.
good. Is my time
speaker.
up?
Huh?
Is my time up? I'm sorry.
You said it's time to say.
Okay, I'm only up to 19, anyway. Go ahead. Let me tell, can I tell this real quick? As to
go
what?
right ahead.
Okay, let me tell you about, we were talking about, now I had in my book about Robert Hernandez that was killed in Vietnam. We had a lady here I was on the Williams County Historical Commission for 25 years. And had a lady, I don't know if she's still on there, she probably is. She was from Round Rock, and she would say all the time, well, that her brother was the only, or was one of the ones, only a Round Rock person killed in World War II. Well, I'd already been hearing over and over again about Zamaripa that was killed in World War II. And I argued with her, and I said, no, there was a Round Rock, a Mexican from Round Rock killed in World War II. Now, this was the chairman of our Williams County Historical Commission for centuries, decades, whatever. She would argue with me there was no Mexican from Round Rock killed in World War II. I would have known him because I would have been to high school with him, blah, blah, blah. So I finally I didn't have in time for that first red book, but Zamaripa's picture and all about him being killed in Santos Zamaripa was killed in World War II. And I got his picture in this book, but that is the type of stuff in history that you get certain people and they just know their side. She might not have even known anybody from the Flats. But in her mind, there was no Mexican killed in World War II from Round Rock. And that's the kind of stuff that made us too, Janie and I were so emphatic on getting the Mexican school. And of course, all of this other school in our first book, we had people that said to me, I've lived in Round Rock all my life, and I didn't know the Mercers ever did that because they didn't ask and they didn't pay attention to it. So I just think that's so important. So I'm so tickled to see y'all. Thank you.
I wanted to tell you, Karen, that Anita's sister-in-law is Santos's widow.
Oh, yes, I had forgotten that.
Yes.
I found that out after I got his picture and went and talked to his mother and so forth.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yes. Oh.
Yes, and that lady is she was my mother's stepsister, so she's my aunt, really.
She's
And
so
Joanne.
Wonderful. You ought to see all her own garage that's quilting and all this history. Oh.
Okay. My name is Janie Carlin Castillo, and I'm fourth generation here in Round Rock. We go back to early 1900s when my great-grandfather came from San Diego de Alejandria in the state of Jalisco. He came down to look for, of course, it was wartime in Mexico and all, and decided that he had a wife and 3 children, decided that he needed a better life for him and his family. So he came across and found work at the construction of the Medina Dam in Castroville. And upon finishing up that job, he knew, well, where am I going to go from here? And he left his family wanting to establish himself first and then send for them or go get them. And so this job was coming to an end, but he was pretty smart. He realized that a lot of the materials that were being brought in for the construction were from the Round Rock White Lime Company. And he asked about, where is this located? Do they need people? Not with the Walsh group that he came at the beginning. But he came on his own and found that there were families here already working for Mr. Walsh. And he secured a job there, was very well liked almost immediately, and they made him foreman of all of the Mexican workers. Mr. Walsh did provide homes for all of his workers so that they would be close by. They didn't have cars or anything. This was job security. And he had 24-hour shifts, of work. So they were right there. They could go from one shift to the next, walk to their jobs, and their families were right there. In 1916, he was able to go back to Mexico and get my great-grandmother, the 2 sons and a daughter, and came to Round Rock. And he had the biggest house in the barrio that Mr. Walsh had provided for his workers. He was really, really liked and respected. And all the other homes were maybe longer, but they were shared by different families, like almost in the idea of a duplex kind of thing. Of course, no running water and no toilets or anything like that. It was all were located around the plant. And this plant was located where the Cisco plant is now, or the frozen food. And that was out of town back then, okay, out of town of Round Rock. And all the little houses were around there where the 7-Eleven is, and all where the church is now. All of this was the homes for the workers. And my great-grandfather, like I said, had the biggest house, and it was called, among them, La Casa Grande, the big house. That was a landmark for all of them. And his house was the only one with electricity. And they all respected my great-grandfather. The workers. It was Don Francisco. And when my great-grandmother arrived, she was very religious, very Catholic. And she said, well, where is the Catholic Church? And he says, well, there is no Catholic Church in Round Rock. She says, oh, I'm not staying. Either you take me to a Catholic church somewhere, or take me home, back to Mexico. Well, he looked around, checked around where the nearest one was in Spanish, and it was at Our Lady of Guadalupe in Austin, or Our Lady of Guadalupe in Taylor. And he went, I believe, to the one in Austin and talked to the priest, wondering if there was any chance that there would be a priest to come maybe once a month to take care of all of these families around the plant. And so they managed to do that, and he would pay his fare on the train. He would see to it that someone would be there to greet him or get him off when he got off the train, and kept him, or hospedarlo, I can't say the word, in his home, in his home, okay? He would stay there with them. And then they would gather all of the people in their home for Sunday service. He would arrive on a Saturday afternoon, and he would have confessions, he would make visits, he would baptize babies if they were some to be baptized, did all of this. Plus, they would wear him out because of the different shifts. People were coming in and out of their jobs, and they needed to talk to the priest, okay, and attention from him. So he was exhausted when he would leave. But that was their mass, their Sunday mass, and all of their religious that they would get in Round Rock for 25 years in his home, okay? Then, and all of the families would come. They all knew each other. And of course, like I say, they loved my great-grandfather. He was very good to all of them. And in 1940, we finally get a church. That's an interesting story too, because they couldn't find land. Well, the diocese realized, and we had a bishop in Galveston, it wasn't even an Austin diocese yet. They realized that there was a need for a Catholic church in Round Rock because they could see that they would report that all these families and the need was there. So they granted, yes, find a place and we will build a church. So the priest from Georgetown looked around and couldn't find any land, finally found the place, I think it was 15 acres, where the old St. William's was. I hope most of you remember, on McNeil Road. And it belonged to a black family that were no longer in Round Rock, but they were willing to sell. And they sold it for a very reasonable amount. I can't even remember exactly. But then the priest in charge decided, we don't need this 15 acres. I will subdivide this and keep only 5 acres, and the rest I think it was 5, and the rest I will sell. Well, my father happened to buy about 5 acres, and that's how we got our own little house later, and we were right behind the Catholic Church in the same plot, or the same area. And one of the interesting things was that the people were so excited to get their own church, to get a church, and they wanted to name it Sagrado Corazón de Jesús. And by the way, these were all Mexican families, and I could very safely say it was a Mexican community because that's all it was. Now I can no longer say that with St. William's. We are worldwide. We have representation of all peoples. And I have caught myself many times because I remember from the old, I could easily say, it was, us Mexicans. Well, many people now have gotten offended because they're Hispanic, but no, they're not Mexican. They come from all over South America and Cuba and Puerto Rico and all these. But anyway, but back then it was all Mexican family. And they wanted to name it El Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, Sacred Heart of Jesus is what they wanted to name their church. And they didn't have any money, so they applied to the Catholic Extension Society for funding, hoping to get something. And they responded, yes, we will. We will be glad to offer you $1,000, but if you name it St. William, we will offer you $1,500. Oh. And so they didn't have a choice, really. So they said, well, we'll name it St. William. I mean, all Mexican families St. William, can you imagine? But they needed a church bad. And and so St. William came, and this was in honor of the bishop that was over the Extension Society named Bishop William something or other. Anyway, so St. William. So that's how our name came to be. Now, those of you that know Round Rock and St. William, we've gone through 4 churches since my great-grandfather's first gathering. We had a church built in 1940. We had one in 1975, in 1982, and then this one that was just the brand new one that we had like in 2000, what, 8, 6, something like that. Anyway, it's very new. It's huge. I don't think we're going to build another one in my lifetime. But in my lifetime, I have been there for all 4 of the churches. And I even got to know my great-grandfather's home because when he passed away, they were still living in the house, although it was the company's house, but it was still, he was still there. And I was about 15 or 16 years old when he died. So I remember the house very well. The priest that we had when we were under construction here wanted so much to tie the old with the new. And I think that was so beautifully done, the way he built a replica of the first church, the 1940. The first plan was to move it to the new site. But in looking at the infrastructure and the old building and everything, they thought it would be easier to build a brand new one to look as closely as possible to the old one. And they named it Sacred Heart Chapel, which is, I think, so beautiful. And then they also, it just touches me, and also they built a replica of my great-grandfather's home, which is now the St. Vincent de Paul office, to reach out to the whole community of Round Rock. And that to me is a wonderful tribute to my great-grandfather too. Once I went to a retreat there at St. William's, and I had to give a little witness, and they wanted you to tie scripture to part of your witness as you went along. It's called the Chirp Retreat, anyway. Christ Renews His Parish. Anyway, my husband is a deacon, and I wrote my story, my witness. Then I said, babe, help me with the scriptures. I don't know how to, the fitting scriptures for the particular times of my story. And he did, and when he wrote the one, when I told about my great-grandfather and the story, he said he used the scripture of Abraham, and God's telling him that his ancestry or what would outnumber the stars or something like that, and I thought, at the time I thought, really? But you know, really, it is true. Abraham then, my great-grandfather now, you know, to see the church and how it has grown. My goodness, it has grown. We're about over 4,000 families and growing. But I don't think we'll build another church. But to me, that is a wonderful part of my history that I love, and I love St. William, and I see how it has just opened its heart and arms and welcomed all these people that have arrived to St. William to make it the community that we are now. It is so beautiful. I just wanted to tell you one more story, and that's a short one. I was born in 1940, so I always feel like I grew up with St. William, you know, the first church in 1940, and of course, they get an uplift every so many years, and here I keep. But since I was born in 1940, and I didn't know any English, no English was spoken in our family at that point. And I went to school at the Mexican school. So when I was in 1945, 46, my primer year, that's what they called it then, it wasn't kindergarten, it was primer. I was put on a bus on McNeil Road by myself because my mother had 12 children, and back then they really didn't go into the community too much. I mean, the Mexican families were kind of to themselves and kind of very humble and didn't mix too much. But it was time to go to school. She put me on the bus. I get to the front of the high school and walk with the rest of the children to the Todd place. That was the Mexican school. No IH-35 yet, so it was a straight shot there. So the big thing there was that you were not allowed to speak Spanish, okay? So a kindergartner, scared to death. I didn't know any English. So the good thing was that we had 3 grades in one room. There was only 2 classrooms, 3 in one, and then 3rd and 4th grade in the next one. By the time you were in the 4th grade, it was time to move on to the regular school because you should have known enough English by then, okay? So here I am in kindergarten. The saving thing there was the older children that were there already, the 1st and 2nd graders in the same class. And one of them was my neighbor, and I always wanted to sit next to her so she could help me out, or I could copy or know what in the world was happening. I didn't get to, when I went to, after my 1st grade, that school they did away with it, no more. So then we were all brought back to the regular school with all of us together, whether you knew Spanish or English or not, but you were all together. So I go to school. My first teacher there is Mrs. Payne, Ms. Boyd's sister. She was wonderful, wonderful. It was so wonderful to come to this school with all these beautiful kids and beautiful clothes, and it was just marvelous. And I did know a little bit of English by then, but I wanted to catch everything and not, make sure that I was on task and knew what in the world was going on. And one day, Miss Payne says, I need you to stay after school today. And oh my God, this is half of the day, and I thought, what have I done wrong? What did I do? And I couldn't imagine what I had done wrong and why I was going to have to stay after school. And I rode the bus, And if I missed my bus, how was I going to get home? All these things. I was just sick for the rest of the afternoon. Finally, the bell rang, and all the children leave, and I have to stay. And she comes to me, and I'm standing there waiting to see what is she going to say. She knelt down to have eye-to-eye contact with me. I was just a kid, you know. So she knelt down and looked right at my face, and she says, "Why do you look at me all day long? You make me nervous." Oh my God, I thought, is that all? I didn't say that, but I thought to myself, oh, you know, and I don't know what I said, but then she let me go and I didn't miss my bus. And I got home. But those were wonderful memories of when we did go back into all of that. Wonderful teachers. I got in trouble one day in the old school, 3 of us. We had an outhouse over there, and we were kids. I mean, I was a kindergartner in 1st grade. I don't know exactly where there, but 3 of us were in the outhouse, and they didn't have big bells or anything to call the children in, right? So the little bell was rung, and I never heard it. We never heard it. We played and talked and all kinds of things. Went outside, and the patio or the yard was completely empty. Everything was quiet. And oh, we're late. What's going to happen? So we walk in, and of course, she was waiting on us. Our teacher, her name was Miss Sweeney for the historical thing, if you ever find her, Miss Sweeney. She wore her hair up in a bun. She was an older lady with a black and white, hair. And she wore, I can just see her, wore shoes like the nuns used to wear, with the little heel and the black, with the tie. And she had bug eyes. Like Betty Davis eyes, you know? And here we come, and she was very upset, like where we were. How could we explain? How could we tell her in English that we'd never heard the bell, or anything? Well, she lined us up, and she spanked each one of us, and one of them, Janie Valdez, every time she would hit her with the thing, Janie would jump and would miss half the time, and it's like, anyway. We didn't tell that episode at home either because we knew that there would be a second, so it was kind of forgotten. But those were crazy things that happened. But anyway, those are some of my memories. But the one of my great-grandfather is truly one that I cherish, I'm proud of, and I am really digging into finding out more about my great-grandfather. Carlin is not a very ordinary Hispanic name, although he did come from Mexico, but I would like to know, how did they get there and from where? And that's my quest. And if Mexico wasn't in such turmoil, I would go in a heartbeat. But I'm waiting and hoping that things will settle so that I can get there one day and dig up all these. I have read 2 books that are put out from their little town, and it is a very religious Catholic community to this day, and I can't wait to one day visit. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Janie. Thank you very much. Whenever I hear that story, it just amazes me. A church with 4,000 families today, where just this past spring a bishop was installed, and it started because a little lady from Mexico who couldn't speak English put her foot down. Absolutely amazing.
And the Miss Carlin and the home and the altar are pictured in our red book, and it tells all about that first spot. We got records of that first, all of the different priests and what all they would do when they came. I mean, the first one said he was so scared he didn't think it was going to be a success, and he got here, and all of this stuff to do that, and he talks about over the entire night because of all the shifts and stuff, and he, real quick, that first time, and he performed 8 that one day and night, 8 baptisms, 3 marriages, visit 2 people that were sick, heard 194 confessions, and administered 367 communions in a 24-hour period.
Yeah.
You think the 194 confessions were from the 3 couples?
I don't know.
And you know what? There are still people now that remember making their first communion in my great-grandfather's home. Mrs. Camacho is one of them. She told me, when the dedication of the church, we were talking, and she said, and I said, "Oh, Janie, I never had heard that." She said, "Yes, I made my first communion in your great-grandfather's living room."
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
Dorothy, it's taken us a while to get to you.
No, that's okay.
Still hanging in it?
That's okay.
It's your turn, ma'am.
My name is Dorothy Blanco Alvarado. My grandfather came from Mexico, like every other family that came to Texas. I don't know too much about him, other than that he worked in the lime kiln in McNeil, with the rest of the other people. There was, McNeil was like a little colony, I guess you might say, or very small town. I went to school there. There was a school building there. I went to school up to the, say, 6th grade maybe. And all the kids of the families went to that school. We had one teacher all the time, because all the grades were taught there, from first to on. And we don't have very many, those of us that still remember, many members of that school, because we did have one crazy teacher that held us, you might say, hostage. She was just mentally not very well. And from then on, after that, we came to Round Rock. I came to Round Rock in the 40s. We lived, like say, in McNeil, and exactly not in McNeil, because the Robinsons, like the Walshes, they had homes in McNeil for the families, for their workers. And so my grandparents, we lived out in a little ranch further, like maybe a quarter of a mile, I would say, from the actual town. And so from there we moved to Round Rock. In the 40s, my dad and my uncles, they all went to war. One of my uncles was lost in action. One memory that I do have, or something that I remember, I don't know whether it was one of the presidents was supposed to come through McNeil Round Rock, and it was either FDR or Truman, which I don't really remember too well. As a matter of fact, I think there was a movie made of that, which Frank Sinatra played in that movie. And that president was to have been assassinated on his travel. And the only thing I remember is that he did go through here, and through McNeil and here, but after that, we never did, hurt anymore. And the other thing, it was, like Janie said, there was no church. But during my time, there used to be a missionary that used to come to McNeil with a trailer. And that's when he served Mass. And they had First Communions and whatever, I made my First Communion in McNeil. I didn't make it here. But that was the only place we could go to church in up until the time we moved to Round Rock. And we did move to the Flats. We didn't move to any other special area of Round Rock. I went to school here, unfortunately.
If I can just interrupt a second, I think Karen had mentioned the Flats too. Maybe not everybody here knows about the Flats. Could you talk about the Flats a little bit?
Well, Flats consisted of, say, like Jesse's family, the Mercers, the black families, the Mercers, the Clarks, Rubios. There was different other peoples that moved in from the Riveras, Hernandez, other Hernandezes besides his family, and it was just a little, everybody knew everybody at that time. We didn't lock our doors. We didn't close our windows. It was safe.
But it's this area right here.
It's
Right
this
behind
Right
area,
here where the
right,
library
right
is.
from here,
Yeah, up
from
to the
here
river.
down,
Up
that,
to the river.
up to the creek or the river, whatever you call it.
Right.
And so, you know, that was, up till now, it's called the Flats, I think. It's kind of,
Bill's called the flag.
yes, it's not, it was not really as run down as it is because some of those houses are really old now. Right, that area where my granddad's house is right now, it's very old, and the Clarks, the Rubios and the Clark family are in that area where the Robinsons used to live. And that's, it's a different family, but it's rebuilt. You know, at first we didn't have too many friends because we after that we met at school, the kids. And like I say, I didn't get to finish school because in my young age I had to go to work. And so that was unfortunate for me, but I did learn my English. In fact, I knew my English when I came to school here. And since then, I had never had any problems with with English. But other kids that I knew didn't know English very well, you know, and we were made fun of because we didn't know. And so therefore, we had to speak Spanish, which they didn't like very much for us to speak Spanish. But as through the years went by, we learned to get along. I mean, you know, that's just one of those things that we have to face in life sometimes when we're young. And we were taught not to disrespect anybody. If you were told to do something, well, you had to do it. Or if you were made fun of, you had to take it. You were not to cause and make a fuss and get into fights or anything like that. So it's one of those things that you learn in life as you grow up. When Ms. Thompson was talking about the Samaripa, just recently, and Virgie might know this, one of his nephews went to where he was buried this year, or just sometime this year, I think it was. He went to his grave and he got pictures and everything, you know, from there. There's a lot of other things that I remember vaguely. I don't, you know, it's hard for me to, I can't remember from yesterday to today. But it was, all in all, some was good, some was bad growing up. I've seen the 4 churches, you know, go up. And like Janie says, hopefully we don't have to build another one here anytime soon. But I never attend the mass or whatever at her grandfather's
No, we
house
were too
because
young,
yes,
yeah.
I was young, but because the church was already built, and all my family. I have one brother. I don't have any. I have one half sister, but we just it was my father's second family. So when I got married, I moved to Georgetown, and then after Georgetown, I came back home, and I've been home since then. My 2 girls graduated from Round Rock High School. Some of you might know one was a teacher, Ms. V, and the other one is, she works in Austin. But, you know, growing up was different for me because those were hard times. We went through a depression. I was here during that depression. My grandparents had to live on, it wasn't, I guess they used to give us stamps to go buy groceries and stuff like that. McNeil was the only store around at that time, but we all my granddad and my uncles, they went to Austin to get other stuff that we might need. My grandfather, while in McNeil, he grew a huge garden, so we didn't have to suffer for vegetables and stuff like that, you know. He grew our own, and it was just something that it was, for me, being the only girl in that family, was kind of fun. You know, it was fun. And my kids say that I was spoiled because I was the only girl, which I think I was. And they were very protective of me. And so then my dad and my two uncles, they went to the service. And so when they came back, they used to go to, we used to go to West Texas to pick cotton, and you know, that was the other way of making money. And but I never did pick cotton. They always sent me to school because they didn't want me to miss school, because my uncles and them never really did get to go to school. And well, they went to school, but they didn't finish. You know, they went to school in I don't know if anybody's familiar with Merrilltown. Merrilltown had a little school, and that's where they went. But like I say, you know, it's the years go by, and you think. And back then, your grandparents really did not say much to you about it. At least mine didn't, because we were taught when there was grown-ups in the home, and you had company or whatever, the young ones had to leave, you know, go outside and play, because we weren't supposed to know, you know, certain things. But other than that, you know, I had a great childhood. I had a great family. But now they're all gone.
And what was your maiden name?
Alvarado.
Oh, yeah.
Benito Alvarado was my grandfather.
Dorothy, the house where that your grandpa bought there, didn't the Hannahs used to live there?
No, it was Killian's.
Who?
Killian's.
Killians.
Uh-huh.
I thought the Hannahs used to
Yeah,
own
no,
that house.
that, back then, the land around Round Rock was very cheap. It was, you know, that's how people, most of the Mexican people that have property now, they bought it back then because it was really, you know, real cheap land. It wasn't that expensive. So they got to buy a lot of land, you know, to build one or two houses in the same property.
Well, wasn't it about the 70s that Austin White Lime, that Robinson put in the filtering system that stopped the dust from being everywhere? Wasn't that?
Yeah, I think
it was like in the early 70s. So until then, everything west of here and part of Round Rock, when the wind was blowing this way,
Yeah.
was covered in white dust.
That's true.
And the smell.
And the smell, and it was, so a lot of that land all around there that we now would have been, it's
Right.
great. It would have been covered with white lime, and you couldn't hardly give it away.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's-
and
that's
it's
true.
amazing how the church made a complete turn, I mean, a complete circle. It started right there at the 7-Eleven, that's where my great-grandfather's house was, right behind the 7-Eleven. And now the new church is right there in the same property almost.
Yeah.
It's all come
It
back
came
together
around,
for
yeah.
to its beginnings.
Let me throw something out here for a question, you guys. I live in Georgetown, I cover Georgetown politics and whatnot. There were never any black or Hispanic people on the Georgetown City Council until they went to single-member districts back in the 1980s. From my perspective, Round Rock had a bit of a different experience. People like Garfield McConaughey, the Rubios, Pete Correa, and I apologize to whomever I'm leaving off the list. What was different about Round Rock in that people who were racial minorities were able to rise into positions of civic influence and power?
The Amistad Men's Club. That's what brought it on.
Can you expound on that a little?
Well, and this was in my brother David's time. You know, he graduated from college, was one of the first ones, and some of these other friends that also graduated, Jesse Molina. They decided, hey, you know, young guys, college, out of college, we need to do something for our community. We need to build, you know, come together and look out for our, especially the students, scholarship programs. That was the main thing. But in doing so, they realized, hey, we need to have representation in the school district. We need to have representation in the city, you know, and all this stuff. And so that's how it all came about. They were political. That Jesse Molina, what does he do now? I don't know. Is he?
He's a lawyer. No, he's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer. Yeah, he was into. They were into politics back in those days, and they still are. The Amistad is very politically
Yeah.
Well,
active.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I think it goes back much further than that and is rooted a little different way. The Palms and the Nelsons in the early families before 1900 were Swedish, and they were they had experienced some of the Swedish coming to America and some of what that meant to be an immigrant family, and were very keen about inclusion of everybody. For instance, the Palms had the Sauls, Wade Sauls, a black man, a large black family. He was the foreman for all of the Palms ranches, and farming, and this was before 1900. And I think those Swedish, because they were very emphatic on inclusion of all people and all ethnic groups. And I think it went back because in 1900, if you were walking the streets of Round Rock on a Saturday, you would hear Swedish spoken more than you would English. But they were very emphatic on including other families, blacks, Mexicans, in the Round Rock employment and so forth. And I think it goes back to the Swedish wanting to be inclusive of everything, and that brought some more of the other families in, and it didn't have this underlying segregation that a lot of communities had. And that's why Round Rock integration and having the black school, the Mexican school, and then integrating to, and some always went, depending on where you lived, all Mexicans and blacks did not go to the black school or the Mexican school. There were some in each of the grades anyway. So I think.
But that happened much later.
Yes, but I mean, no, I mean, even in 1900, there were some of them that were going to school and not going to the segregated schools. So I think that early family inclusion just brought it forward and made it easier as El Amistad came along and others. I think that's what made it somewhat easier
I never
for this
saw
community.
it before. I never saw it before until then.
But I think it was more in the employment and the business people
The
and so forth.
employment, maybe.
A feeling of the community that was there that helped it. I'm not saying we had back then had total segregation. It was not the case. But there was more of it than a lot of other communities at the same time. So somehow I think that built into it.
Jess, you were going to say something?
Yes.
No, I was just gonna say that as far as hiring people to work at the post office, Mexicans, they weren't allowed until, Louis Beltran, 1972, 73? And it had to do with La Amistad Club pushing or, whatever, having to do,
They really did a lot to get the inclusion of in the political.
Yeah. One more quick question, if I may. Janie, did you have an ancestor in your family who was known as Annie and she fed people in the neighborhood?
No.
No, that was
No.
not?
No.
No.
That was something else.
You're right, but I thought maybe Annie.
No.
No, it was
was she,
something
It is
else.
way
was she Carlene?
No,
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 this
this was
is
an
way
Anglo,
back.
Okay.
Anglo family that moved earlier on to St. William area, or I don't even know if it was, but it was in the Round Rock West area that did this, but no. And this is since all the growth.
The story was that she'd go out and feed on
Yes, and
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving, and so Annie's Ways has
And-
continued.
And from that, we have the Annie's Way Thanksgiving
Yeah.
community dinner, which Jess's brother Tino has kind of been the head person of leading it for years and years now. So.
Oh, Tino heads off everything. We're going to have I'm sure you've read it in the paper, the community hospital, free at St. William, called Sacred Heart again. That's wonderful, but yeah, Tino's behind all of that too.
But
Yes, ma'am.
We have come a long ways
Oh, yeah.
from the 40s, up until now. Because the 40s were hard. They were hard for us kids and hard for our families.
In the time we have left, do you all have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How did the flats get the name flats? Anybody
I don't know, we never called it the flats
We never-
way
I don't
back.
know.
It's now recent, and
Well, it's been called that, I know, since the 60s.
oh, yeah,
So, I mean, yeah, but I mean, it was,
Right. It was,
And I don't even know why they call it maybe it floods.
It probably does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Last time it wiped out pecan.
Uh-huh.
Who knows?
back then, we only had one sheriff. And I don't know if anybody knows, Mr. Loving was a deputy here.
constable.
Yes, and then after that, Johnny Rapke came along. And it's just one of those things.
And the night watchman.
And a night watchman.
Yeah, with
Who was
the,
the one, was it Repke with the one hand or one?
No.
that was Farrell.
It was Farrell.
Farrell, yeah.
But the night watchman, our little old town with his little flashlight going, looking into the buildings. Can you imagine?
Yeah, the constable, night watchman, had both his hands cut off at the gin. And he was the night watchman, but I don't know how he did it, but they all said, everybody was scared to death of him. He just was, I don't know how he did it.
Very
Both his hands
respected.
were cut off. How did they
Yes.
tell about it?
Yes. I have a picture of him somewhere.
But it was a peaceful community, so
Yeah.
we didn't
Yeah, it
need,
wasn't like.
we didn't need big guns.
You guys have any other questions?
Any comments?
Y'all know the first time that, let me ask a question. When do you think the first time Round Rock, Texas appeared in the New York Times or the London paper? Barbette. Had to be Barbette. No, it wasn't Barbette. Barbette was famous maybe in the theatrical. It was the Baylor accident.
Oh, yeah.
The 10 Baylor students killed in the 20s. And that was the first time Round Rock, Texas had been as a name in a byline in a story, New York Times and other world papers.
Okay, tell them where it was and what's there now, because some may not know.
Okay, well, there's really nothing there because it happened at the railroad track. So right down from the corner of Main Street and Mays, used to be the Cobble store, and now y'all tell me what's there now, I don't know.
The one after Sarah.
The bar.
One after Sarah Doris. Okay, then think down where the railroad track is, where the road, the overpass goes over the railroad. There was no overpass then, and the Baylor students were on this little bus. It's pictured in here. It's hard to imagine this school bus going to the University of Texas to play them in basketball. A rainy Saturday morning, and the driver was a student and got down to where the railroad track was, and a passenger train going very fast, which they did. Of course, they go faster than the freight trains, was coming from San Antonio, and he tried to turn and hit the bus, and you have 10 Baylor students that were killed and many others injured. And at that time, the Round Rock didn't even have about 1,000, 28, 29, 27, I keep forgetting the exact date. And so it was around 1,000, 1,200 residents, and it was very traumatic to happen in a small town. This led to the highway department starting a program to start overpasses over railroads. There was no overpass over a single railroad in Texas, yet we had the most railroad miles, the most train tracks of any state, of course, being the largest. So that started the process of building the overpasses. And right down from there, there's a big plate marker that tells about it. And it was very hard on Round Rock at the time, being a small town, for something this bad to happen there. and it took them a long time to really get over it. And, but something did good come out of it. They started the overpasses. So that was, and then the hearings and the highway department and so forth. And that was kind of really the first time that Round Rock you see mentioned in a legislative session and that sort of stuff because of that Baylor accident.
Why don't you tell us about the Archives War?
The Archives War is an interesting event in the 1840s, and then when you had Sam Houston elected as president of the Republic, he had land and was very instrumental in Houston, well, it became Houston, Harris County, Harrisburg, and that whole area, Washington on the Brazos. They wanted the capital to be in a central part of the Republic. And of course, the Republic went all the way up to Wyoming, was quite large, but they were determined to select a good place for the capital and had a committee. Imagine that, the first legislature of this Republic of Texas, this nation, and they did a committee to go look to see where the capital should be built. And so all of the Maribel B. Lamar had been to what was Waterloo. Austin became Austin. Waterloo was down on the Colorado River, and he had been hunting there, and he had noticed how it had this wonderful, I think when you read this from his description, this plain there on the river that looked up to a hillside. And he envisioned that as a Congress Avenue and the capital of the Republic being built on that hill. And so Austin was building and was becoming, had some hundreds, 800 citizens now, 200, then 400, and so forth, And so, but Houston did not like Austin to be the capital. He wanted it to be in Houston, in Harris County, in that area. And so then when he became president, they decided, well, we'll just flat move it. And we have these records and we have this other stuff, and we're going to move it. And so they put it on a wagon and they head out this way. And Kinney Fort was where they're going to spend the first night because that was as far as they could go by wagon. Even back then, a trip from Round Rock to Austin, Jollyville to Austin, all of that was a full day by wagon or horseback. The reason most counties in Texas are the size they are, most of them are square in some point, and the county seat is in the middle because they didn't want the counties to be any larger than what it would take from a person to ride horseback from anywhere in the county to get to the county seat in one day. So most of them are a one-day horseback ride. And so by wagon, that was as far as they could get at night. They came to Kinney Fort, and Mrs. Eberly got wind of all this and warned all these people in Austin, told them that they had taken the records and they were headed this way. And so they figured, well, they've gone, then they sent someone this way, a scout, and said they're at Kinney Fort. And so a whole group from Austin comes out to Kinney Fort and take the records and take them back to Austin. So the archives were saved and brought back to Austin, and the capital was remained in Austin, even though.
Movie of that?
Well, they've reenacted it in a lot of things.
Well, they should make a movie, I think. Wouldn't that be exciting?
Yeah, it's probably not enough for a whole movie, but it's interesting anyway. It's one of those good Republic of Texas. We only had the Republic from April 21st, 1836 to February 19th, 1846. February 19th, 1846. So there was just 10 years of the Republic. And that's one of the better stories. And that did end out here. Now, in most of the stuff in the historical markers, like the historical marker at the State Library down by the Capitol, it just talks about the records were saved. And, it's like, well, say they were out at Kinney Fort at Round Rock, but they just say they were saved. They didn't say where.
Well, thank you all. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did the railroad have any impact on Round Rock? I noticed the tracks are here. Did it ever stop? Or was it just for the cattle drives or what?
Oh,
No,
we
there
had a
wouldn't be a
depot.
town of Round Rock because there was just the town over on the Chisholm Trail. And when the railroad came through in 1882, 81, 82, 83, when they were building it, it stopped right down here. And then it was just immediate that people came down and started building here and were the new town. And for a long time, it was just the new town. And then became New Round Rock and Old Round Rock. And then they dropped the Old Round Rock. It became Old Town. and so forth. The Washington Anderson that they were talking about, the home, that Washington Anderson's home down there, and it was, he had the first 320 acres here, and he put to the post office for this to be called Andersonville. But there was already an Andersonville in Texas. So they rejected the Andersonville, and then they thought about something else. They finally submitted Round Rock because they had a Round Rock over on the old town. And so it was accepted, and then eventually the new post office was here, and the town was Round Rock. But if there had not been another Andersonville, because Washington Anderson was very famous in the Battle of San Jacinto. He's pictured in Huddle's painting when you go in the Capitol, the picture on the left side when you go in from the south, from Congress, the big picture of Santa Ana with Sam Houston sitting under the tree, and that Washington Anderson is one of the people that's pictured there. And he was very famous in the Texas Revolution, Washington Anderson. So they were very much had wanted the town to be Andersonville. So that the home that's at the Methodist Church was the home that he built for his daughter. They just had one child. And that was her home, and then his home was further over on the creek there. So, and then he's the one that sold all the land to so forth.
I'll tell you a small world story about that painting you just mentioned, and it's, you know, you walk into the Capitol, it's that big painting of Santa Ana surrendering to Sam Houston. A couple of months ago, I had some business to do in Austin. It was some family business, and my wife and I took an elderly friend of the family. She's in her 80s, been friends with her for years. Down there, she'd been wanting to go to the Capitol, hadn't been there for years. She's about fourth generation Austin. And so we take her in there, and she just planted herself in front of that painting and stared at it for a while. And I said, Claire, and I'm going to have to do the Claire voice in a minute here. I said, Claire, what is it about that painting that intrigues you so? And she says, do you see that doctor sitting there? And I said, yes, I do. She says, that's my great-grandfather. I'm like, holy cow.
Now that was who? Say that again.
And I can't, Claire Howell.
Okay.
But I don't know the great-grandfather is what his last name would have been. But she said that was her great-grandfather, the doctor in the painting. I love that stuff. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you and good night.
I'd like to thank our panelists. Give them a hand. Mary, if you want to hear a couple of the stories on the very first DVD that we had from a year and a half ago, they do talk about some of the experiences with the train, especially how they would throw out food during Thanksgiving time so people had at least a decent meal to eat, especially when it was rough times. So I do appreciate everybody being here, and there is some food over there to eat, and that poor tres leches cake has been sitting there for a while, so it may be tres leche mud. But y'all enjoy yourself, and thank you again, all of you, for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
His third.
And also, I want to thank Brooks and Mark for spending their time here. One's in was Public Works, the other person works for communication. Thank you very much. Thank you all.